like to welcome you to the pre-COFES unofficial afternoon sessions that we put out each year for the folks who arrive at COFES before the quote-unquote official opening at 6 p.m. for our reception down in the Courtyard Cabana. This is our 14th annual COFES. We've had 3 international events, a precursor to COFES. We counted recently, I think 1,200 different people have been to at least one COFES event over the years. Anyway, enough of that. You'll hear a lot more about that tonight and tomorrow and over the next few days. Right now, I just want to welcome you. Can you give yourselves a round of applause for showing up? We have a keynote speaker tomorrow who I think that you'll be excited about, and that keynote speaker is being sponsored by 3D Systems Geomagic. I also want to thank our other sponsors for the meal sponsors and the technology suites, which you'll learn more about tomorrow. And what we're going to do this afternoon is we have a time slot that goes for about an hour. The next presentation is a round robin, 3 20-minute sessions, half an hour apart, round robbing on computing futures. It'll go at starting with Mike Riddle at 4:30, 5 o'clock with Kai Bachman, and then John Herstick at 5:30. Then we'll go over to the pool. But this session, traditionally, Cyon Research spends an hour talking about its research in a hastily unprepared fashion. And Cambashi comes in and spends the next hour in a very well thought out, organized, hard data presentation. But what we thought we would do is take the best of both, combine them into one, and get the data portion stuff out of the way first. And for those that really wanted to hear about it, they would come early. And that must be you. Either that or you didn't have anything else to do on this beautiful day. So Cambashi deals with hard market figures on what has happened globally. And Tony Christian will give us a great deal of information about that. That's not what Cyon Research does. By the way, for those of you that don't know, COFES is an event that is created by Cyon Research. It's owned by Cyon Research, and we invite all our friends to come and participate. But first and foremost, Cyon Research is an industry analyst firm, a think tank. But what we study is not market figures, but what customers are thinking and what they're likely to be thinking on a global basis. And each year we do a study that is quite broad in its scope. The most recent study that we published in January had 2,000 respondents. And I'll give you a little bit of the statistics on the study as we go through the slides. And what I'm going to do is to give you an idea of the scope of the data, pull out some highlights from the data that we just published in January, and then also show you some glimpses of the data that we have for the survey right now in progress. It doesn't close until June, I think it's June 15th. And we have a significant enough, I think 800 gross respondents. And I just pulled some core data down. And I've thrown it into the slides. I did this right before I left on Thursday. When we get to those slides, which will have a very unique color characteristic, I ask that you not take pictures of the screen, and that you not tweet photos of the screen for those data, because that data it's not been cleaned, it's not been vetted, it hasn't been analyzed, we don't stand by it, it's not ready for prime time, but it's interesting, which is why I'm willing to show it at this point in time. So what are we trying to learn? When we do our study, we're trying to get attitudes, actions, expectations, projections of what customers whose firms use software for design and engineering to create stuff. I mentioned that we talked about the most recent study. The current one that we're looking on, we're trying to get that published in the fourth quarter of 2013. So for the study last year, we don't always ask the same questions. We ask questions on differentiation, on hardware issues, productivity, how companies acquire software, where companies feel they are on the software maturity curve, their economic output, and spending priorities. And in the current study, we repeated the questions on economic outlook, and spending priorities, but we also added areas of interest on silo coordination, preference for best-in-class, software stickiness, unsolved problems, which we have a lot of really rich data to dive into, but it's all text, and so there's a lot of analysis that will need to be done on it after the fact, and technology engagement and mobility. So what questions did we ask? So for differentiation criteria, we want to know how firms differentiate themselves from their competitors. So this is how Joe's Hardware Shop or Joe's Tool and Die differentiates itself from its competitors. Basically how the companies sell themselves. And the reason that we want to understand this is to look at what they're trying to do in terms of selling themselves and then the actions that they're taking in terms of the decisions that they're making with regards to software. So this is the gross chart, and what you can see is the 16 different areas in which we gave criteria for them to say, this is the most significant and this is not significant, left to right. Blue is most, red or brown is not significant. And so this is the aggregate of all of the results, and it's listed by the number of those who said it was the most important. And this is interesting, but it's very, very hard to deal with. So we do things like throwing these into a spaghetti chart. So here, what we're looking at is, among these 16 areas, how do respondents from different regions around the world differ? And in most areas, they are similar, but we have the Americas in blue, EMEA in purple, and Asia Pacific in orange. And in some areas, EMEA stands out as having a higher priority on how they sell themselves, or a lower priority on how they sell themselves. And in the areas of sustainability, it's one of the areas where there's the most spread, with, interestingly, Asia Pacific being the highest among our respondents. We can do it by revenue as well. We've got a number of different categories here. The light blue is less than $30 million in revenue. The dark blue is more than $1.5 billion. But sometimes it's better if we simplify things. So we can look at it between small and not small, where the dividing line is $30 million, and the light blue is small, and the dark blue is, the light green is small. They're smaller than $30 million, and the light dark green is larger than $30 million. And some of these things are kind of to be expected. Distribution and differentiating on distribution and on brand is a characteristic you would think is more important to larger firms than smaller firms. But as we dive deeper into this, there are more and more interesting things going on, but sometimes it gets really complicated. For instance, this is a spaghetti graph where I've highlighted 4 different sectors of the many sectors that we have dealing with it. And while I can go in on my high-resolution screen and see what's going on and play with this, this is kind of tough to swallow. So we can take it and put it in a different form. And this is kind of telling, and I'll try and point this out. The column on the left is sectors where that particular criterion is more important to those sectors than in the rest of the bulk of them. And the right column is where it is less important than the rest. And the bolded ones are where those differences are more profound. For those that are interested in seeing this, our report, which we charge $2,000 for, our subscribers get it for free, is made available for free to the world on our website 12 months after we initially publish it. So this will be eventually made available to everyone. And on the COFES website, after COFES, we will be publishing the slide deck for your review under a password protection. We also look at things like the role. So here what we're looking at is for the C-suite. Remember, left is more important, right is less important. The blue dots are for respondents from the C-suite, CEO, CTO, CIO, etc. And then the white rows are for 2010, the yellow rows are for 2012, and we can see some changes. One of the things that's interesting is that in two areas, the level of importance changed and decreased from 2010 to 2012 for CXOs. Brand had a significant increase. But it's also interesting to look at how CXOs, what's happened on the design and engineering respondents, those not from the C-suite, and how they have changed their opinions over time. Now, when it comes to hardware, one of the things that we've been tracking for quite some time is refresh rate. How often do companies churn their hardware? And then recently we added the question about, for you, the person responding to the survey, what do you use the most for your primary machine? And, how often do you refresh hardware? Well, we have for desktops, for laptops, for high-performance computing, other shared resources, and hardware on lease. And this is a global result among all of the 2,000 respondents. And what you'll see is that right now, for desktops, it's about half are refreshing more often than every 3 years, and the other half are refreshing 3 years or longer. Now, that's changed over time, because if we go back and look at the data that we have the best longitudinal data, which is for U.S. respondents, we can see the red-green line here is the difference between 3 years or more and 2 to 3 years. And so over time, people are holding on to their desktops significantly longer, significant enough to move economic numbers. Now, we can also slice this by region, and we can see U.S. and EU for desktops and laptops are pretty much the same. For that 3-year mark is a little bit less than 50%. But what's really interesting here is what's going on in China. This was an unexpected result coming out of the data, and it's a very strong result, not only because of the difference there, but the number of respondents behind it. The sample size from China alone here is almost 890. The other thing that's interesting is what's happening in the 2 years or less mode. 35% or 38% of the respondents from China using desktops are refreshing faster than every 2 years. Now we're going to call back to this because we found some other results in our data that give some insight as to what might be happening. We also wanted to know what type of computers are people working. We have workstations in the darker colors, laptops in the reds, and desktops in the blues. And so if we looked at it by region, there's a significant amount of variability. And what I've done here is I've grouped the workstations together. And you can see that 72% of the EU respondents were using workstations as their primary computer. CIS, for those that don't know, is Russia and many of the former Soviet states. Look at the low number for workstations in China, 31%. We can turn that number on its side a little bit and group it differently. Now we're going to group it by desktops versus laptops. And what we can see is that half of the respondents from China are doing work on laptops. It's a 50-50 proportion. Whereas in CIS, it's a 9-to-1 ratio. And we can also go and look across regions on a product-by-product basis. So within the US, there's not a lot of difference between the profile of a SolidWorks unit, hardware profile of a SolidWorks customer and an AutoCAD customer. And in CIS, other than the proportion of proportion of desktops to laptops, the profile is pretty much the same. But it's a big difference when we go to AutoCAD class products. And Compass, which is a very prominent competitor to AutoCAD in Russia, has a very similar profile to the AutoCAD users in Russia. So last year we asked a new question, which was targeted at understanding the thinking of customers. Why are they making decisions? And what is their perception of the value of different things? So we asked them for these areas: portability, user interface, collaboration, disk performance, compute performance, graphics performance, and remote work. For if they could receive a significant improvement in one of these areas, how much of a difference would it make? And we had a very clear definition, which was that very significant meant that a significant improvement in one of these areas, for me, would be noticeable to the firm in terms of my productivity. Significant would be, it would be a noticeable difference, but to me, and the firm would receive the benefit, but the firm might not notice it. The light blue was less significant, and the orange would not make a difference. So if we look at one of these areas, just portability and mobility, and we can look at across different roles and across regions how things differ. And, this is kind of to be expected. For U.S. respondents, not a lot thought that mobility and the big improvement in mobility would be noticeable to their firm. China, where they're running 50% laptops, had a very, very strong response here. And what was really interesting is, why is the C-suite, why do respondents who are C-level executives in China, why do they believe that improvement in mobility for them would be significant to the firm? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a very, very intriguing result. And we did the same thing for compute performance, and this is not unexpected. And then we have all sorts of other stuff that I'm just going to kind of fly by here, because of the time. We wanted to know who's involved in the selection process, where firms are on the technology maturity curve. Bleeding edge means that the companies are working with the vendors at the beta stage and deploying that software during beta. Leading edge is deploying right when it's released, and so on all the way back. And while that's a nice curve, if we throw out the stuff back here where there's no strategy or it's driven by requirements of the customers, we get a nice pie chart, which is enlightening. And if we can look at that pie chart, we can look at US versus China by revenue. And in the middle, it's, pretty much the same. But what's interesting here is in the US, there's the folks on the leading edge, that is in front of the curve, there are a higher percentage of them in small firms than there are in large firms. Whereas in China, it's just the opposite. And we have a rich enough data set. I mean, for all of these countries, we have at least 100 respondents. We can see that the profile in Spain and the profile in Italy are quite similar. The profile in Germany is not that different, except there are more of those who are behind the curve or laggards. And France is just odd, as in that it has a lot of laggards, a lot in front of the curve, and very few, very, very few in the mainstream. By the way, this is for small firms. We can also look at the results for AEC versus manufacturing, and there's some very interesting results here. And I believe that this is called the Lake Wobegon effect. Everybody is ahead of the curve. We can talk about actions taken and actions planned, hiring and firing. We ask questions about revenue projections, software spending projections. We have spending, additional spending, and the yellow here is what has happened, and cutting that has happened. We can break that down by region. We can talk about the actions that are planned, and we can break that spend down. And this is where I want to say, wherever you see these colors, please do not take a picture of those slides. So, spending for software tools. Compared to the prior year, no change. This is for the first half of the year, the second half of the year, the projection for the first half of this year, and the projection for the first half of next year. And what it means here is that it's relatively stable on those that are going down and about flat on those that are planning on spending more. But we can look at that over time. For US respondents, we can see that it was really bad, and then it's getting less bad, but then it's kind of relatively stable growth. We can go via region, and we can break down by product. And I want to point out here that the way to read this and this is the net change in software spending by respondents from China who have CATIA V5 is expected to decrease, while respondents from US with Inventor expect their net spending on software to increase more than 3%. It doesn't mean that more money is going to be spent on Inventor. It means that respondents with Inventor have bigger budgets, or more increasing budgets. So again, when you see these colors, please no photos. This is the data on in progress for the current next four half years, and what you can't see down here is that this is dead on flat. So no new spending, no new cutting across the gross numbers that we have coming in. It's dead flat. And this is 330 respondents at this point in time when I took this. I'm not going to go through that in purpose of time. For next year, we're talking about gross revenue from those firms having a slight increase on average. That's not the net or the sum, but that's the average of those respondents. We're not going to talk about staffing changes, but we will talk a little bit about spending priorities. So many firms cut so much for so long that the idea of putting 10% back into software spend is not that unreasonable. And we gave them a budget of 10 coins, and we said, if you have 10 coins to spend in these areas, where would you spend them? Number 1 and number 2, extra capability in simulation and additional seats of software. Now, that's interesting, but depending on how you group them, I mean, there are a lot of things up there to deal with. What happens when you sort of put them together? By the way, these are the numbers in progress. Again, the symbol. The highest numbers here, extra capability in simulation, additional seats of software. By far, the next one down is collaboration software and software for analysis in early design stage.
Right.
Yes?
Were you more specific about simulation, whether it was very CAE-oriented and manufacturing process?
We actually have this in the front-end data from where they're coming from. So that's a part that I haven't got to here, but all of this requires a lot of context, and we provide the context up front. Actually, more than half the survey is context, not data. But when we group these, we have upfront design, which is software for analysis in the early design stages, requirements analysis, and extra capability in schematic design. That's more important than general analysis or collaboration or additional seats of software. If we break this down by region, this was another one of those surprising results. It's a little scary, actually. They have a lot of manufacturing going on in China, and now there's a lot of emphasis on stuff on upfront design. What are the implications of that result? I can speculate a lot, but it is something that I'm going to be paying quite a lot of attention to. And then the other part of this was software is only part of the overall budget. If you have to allocate to software, among other things, what's most important? Well, number 1, training and education for existing personnel, followed quickly by better hardware. And this has been consistent as long as we've had these up there over time. And if we look at the current data that's coming in, again, better hardware, training and education for existing personnel, and a big drop to the ability to manage data. Better software tools is far behind. So all of this was about stuff from the last survey, and some of the stuff that we repeated again for this year. I want to talk for a couple of minutes, and I'm running a little long, that's okay, about what we are looking at for the current survey. So we wanted to learn more about silo coordination for embedded software and for electronics. Whose responsibility are each of these? Is it an integrated thing on a project-by-project basis, or is it centralized? What's the development process and the coordination? And so half of the respondents in this survey at this point in time for the unvetted data without any qualifications, some of whom are doing AEC, about half are incorporating electronics in their products. And of those, there's a pretty good split. We have in-house EDA specialists, in-house design and development engineers who also do non-EDA stuff, in-house folks who are not EDA specialists doing EDA, and then working with external suppliers. Breakdown between those that have a central group for EDA and have teams that include EDA folks. And then I'm going to have to read this for you, but we have a third have an electrical and mechanical development team that use the same integrated process. Another third use processes that are different but tightly coupled. A quarter have coordination at milestones, and then a small number have coordination at release to manufacturing. What would be really interesting to see on that last slide is what percentage of these are new to the business and what percentage of those are actually successful. And then we have those that use stage gates, separate EDM and PLM, linked EDM and PLM, integrated systems for both PLM and EDM, and I suspect most of those are, well, we won't go there. Embedded software, a little more than a quarter of those predominantly have in-house specialists. A larger portion have a central group for software. And then the stage gates, again, this is integrated process. This is tightly coupled but separate processes. These are project milestones, and then a little bit that happens at release to manufacturing. So I'm going to skip over the preference for best-in-class versus manufacturing. Software stickiness. This is one of my favorite questions. The first part of this question is, are you happy with your current CAD software? And surprisingly, 70% are happy with their current software, which means that 30% aren't. And for those that haven't switched, why haven't they switched? And we have a bunch of questions about that. Oh, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. So we asked those that have gone through a switch recently within the last 4 years why they switched. And then this was a text response. So I had to go in and read about 300 or scan 300 text responses and tally them up into these categories. And the most often, they're listed in order of importance, or client demand, cost, consolidation, moving to BIM from non-BIM systems, and the lament, my system got end-of-lifed, which is analogous to the folks with hardware saying they're holding on to it till it breaks. When they made the switch, this was a map from the last time we did this, was several years ago, but we can track actually from what CAD system they went from and what CAD system that they went to. And because we have unbalanced respondent bases, we may have many more respondents who have product A than we have from product B. It's not telling what that flow is. What's telling is what they're jumping from. Are they jumping from an existing mainstream MCAD to another mainstream MCAD? Or are they going in one direction or another? We have a great deal of text responses on what would make a difference. And the first part of that is on answers that are software that's already out there that their firm doesn't have that they really could use. And then we ask them why it would make a difference. The second part is for software that they don't believe exists, what would make a difference that the vendors could do in relatively short term, a couple of years. And the third one, or the last one, was what should vendors start working on today that isn't going to be solved in the short term, but they need to start working on it now as we move forward. And I really am anxious to go and dive into this later this summer. We track technology engagements, and we have a number of issues on where companies are thinking in terms of cloud-based technologies, social technologies, and a large number of other technologies. And we want to know, have they looked at it and turned it down? Are they not paying attention to it? Are they watching it? Or are they actually acting on it in some way? This is the result from the most recent survey which we did, which was 2010 or 2011, and this is very hard to read. so I'm not really going to go through it, but there's a lot of data in here about what the uptake is, and we can track the uptake differentially over time. And when it comes to mobility, we ask them, give us a number from 1 to 100 on what percentage of time do you spend away from your desk working. And the median is about 20% of the time. And it will be quite interesting to see how this correlates both to roles, to regions, and to the tools that they have. Now, Mark mentioned before about what type of simulation. Half of this 40-minute survey is about understanding who is responding. What country are they from? How big is the firm? What's their seat count? What's their role? What's their responsibility in the buying process? What's their personal use of what types of systems? What industry sectors are they from? What CAD systems do they use primarily? What are the other CAD systems they deal with? What CAE systems do they have in their firm? Data management, other software, which we use not as market data, but as context, because it's very easy to misinterpret this data. If we have more respondents that are coming from one source than another, we have to make sure that a response that we see from C-level executives is because it's from C-level executives and not because we have more C-level executives from small firms than we do from large firms. So we need to go back and correlate and test and do statistics on all of the data before we present them to you, which is why those other things I don't want to actually get out. Excuse the Russian, but these are companies from respondents from China, from the US, from EU, rest of the world, and from CIS, small versus large firms, which maps, this is pretty similar to what we've seen in the past, about half are small firms, but a good number of larger firms. We don't need to go into that. And so the real question is, where do we go from here? The quick answer is to Tony, and I'll let Tony get ready. But the longer answer is, we need to hear from you about the questions that are pressing on your mind and the things that are actionable. Because all of this stuff is really interesting, but what information is going to make a difference in terms of the actions and decisions that you need to take? And for anybody who would like to dive into this a little bit more, I suggest you go and look at the prior survey that was released, available free to the public, and I'd be happy to give any firm a one-time deep dive just to get a feel for what's going on. Anyway, thank you. And
thank you, Brad.
Tony.